Hello, everyone. On behalf of our team at Icertis, I'd like to welcome you to our today's webinar, Building a Resilient Supply Chain Through Effective Contracting and Supply-Based Management. I'm George Painumkal, Senior Director of Product Management at Icertis, and I'm joined by Vivek. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Vivek Bharti. I am the General Manager of Product Management responsible for portfolio of business applications, which includes our applications on sourcing, risk management, and everything to do with supply chain as well. Looking forward to discussing this great topic, which is very close to my heart.
So before we get into the meat of the topic, as we mentioned, we represent Icertis, which is a leading contract intelligence platform as recognized by leading analysts such as Gartner and Forrester, and more importantly, by our rapidly growing customer base, which includes some of the world's leading companies. We're proud that they have chosen Icertis to be their partner. Our platform contains all the technologies to digitally manage your contracts, use AI to accelerate your time to value from those contracts, and a suite of offerings to help you with supply chain management, including sourcing, risk management, and obligations management, all accelerated by AI. And now let's dive into our agenda. So in today's session, we'll go over a few things. One is, what resiliency means, how should you think about it in the context of your business? What are the components of resiliency which you should focus on? Then we'll also spend a little bit of time looking at specifically at contract teams and professionals and what enterprises need to think about when building this resilience muscle and capability into their contracting workflows and playbooks. So with that, maybe we can get right in and just talk about, in recent COVID events notwithstanding, conversations around resiliency have been increasing over the past 5 to 10 years. Maybe we start with, why the heightened interest in supply chain resiliency? Vivek, what are your thoughts on that?
I think you bring in a very valid point, George. So this talk of supply chain resiliency has been around. I've been a practitioner. It's been around the last 10 or 12 years, but it was something that was nice to have framework that organizations would like to have, would love to talk about. And it was something that, corporates would present at these supply chain and risk forums, win awards, but maybe not a bonus for implementing any of that. So from there, what has happened recently, because of, the disruption that we had due to the pandemic, it's actually the lack of it actually is become amplified. If you're not resilient, you really found it difficult to sustain your business. So that's I think one thing that's contributed. The other thing is this pandemic caused people to take a look and realize that there's a difference between the improbable and the impossible. So earlier, when things were all fine, what we thought was improbable is, as it is, it won't ever happen. But, with the pandemic, the global scale of disruption that we had, people realized that even the improbable can happen, and you've got to have ways and means to sort of come out of those eventualities if they were to happen. And people found themselves to be, ridiculously, I would say, unprepared when this actually happened. The third thing that happened during this, mass sort of disruption was people started understanding how each part impacts the whole of supply chain. So, one of the things about resiliency is unless you really understand how each and every part impacts the other, it's difficult to build on that. And the fourth thing was even the people who had thought about it did not really have the, enabling, I would say, the paperwork in place or the process framework in place. Earlier, what was thought was if you've got a partner who's responsive enough, that's your resiliency. But then when they were hit by this, that they really realized that even if the partner was willing to help you out and help you sort of recover from, whatever situation you are in, there was the paperwork, the process framework that was still missing. So all of this, actually, all these things came to the fore in this disruption, and everyone started sort of talking about this. But the great danger is when everyone talks about something, it tends to become a buzzword, and that's one thing that I'm personally afraid of. That I hope it doesn't become a buzzword, and we actually follow it up with some real action. Right?
Yeah, it's a good point. It seems like historically, resiliency was something that people thought they had maybe based on handshake agreements and an understanding versus having really baked that into their platform, into their relationships, and adding that rigor that's required. So you mentioned that resiliency has become a buzzword. So maybe we spend a little bit of time now talking about, okay, what when we say resiliency at a company, what exactly does that mean? For many companies, it can have a number of different meanings, including for the people who are actually saying it. So if you're in a particular vertical, you'll have one definition of it. If you're a consulting company or a practitioner, depending on your business function, then you'll have a different take on it. So maybe we, should define, okay, what does resiliency mean within the supply chain for a company?
Okay. I think, yeah, that's a great sort of discussion point. So let me put it this way. Resiliency, I mean, one thing that's definitely changing, and the perception about resiliency has changed and for the better, is that resiliency is not like an event response kind of thing. It's a journey, right? It's not, so the earlier view used to be, if this happens, this is what we'll do, and that's resiliency, right? If you've got an arrangement for that or somebody willing to do it. But it's actually, what people are realizing is that if you have a disaster, when it happens, you just kind of recover from that. That's not a very good thing. So as the disaster was happening, the signals were coming in. If you were able to adapt for the emerging situations, right? That's resiliency. So I would say one thing is that it's an ability to continuously adapt to significant changes. Now, I mean, every little changes people do adapt to, but emerging significant changes, that's your resiliency. That's one definition.
Mhm.
But equally, I mean, that's one definition, but let me say there's no single model for supply chain resiliency. Each company is different. Each supply chain is different. So you really got to look at a few things, and that's what I'll talk about, and define what your supply chain resiliency model is going to be. So the things to look at, I think that's common, but the conclusions and the model you come out with will be different. So the things that every company should look at is the impact of each part of the supply chain on cash flow, bottom line revenue, because that's the most important sort of business metrics. So how each part of the supply chain, whether it's the inventory at the vendor's end or whether it's the logistics cost or different elements of supply chain, how they're impacting these business metrics, understand that. The second is identify your essential services. So be very hard about it. So we are used to prioritizing things into buckets, that these 5 things are P1 and the next 5 and the next 5. From there, get into a habit of stack ranking, the necessity or the essentialness of, any given service that you need, because that will come in play when you are actually trying to put a service or resiliency model in place. The third thing I would say is define your service level objectives. So once you've sort of stack ranked the essentialness of different services based on the impact that you assess of different parts of your supply chain, define a very realistic service level objective that, if a disaster were to happen or if a disruption, major disruption was to happen, what is a realistic sort of service level to which I must restore myself, rather than saying I'll go back to 100%.
Yeah.
Be realistic about it, and that level is different for each company based on your customers. It could be different for different customer segments as well. And in how much time do you need to sort of recover yourself and be up and running? So that's what I refer to as sometimes as SLO, service level objective, and service time objective, very similar to RPO and RTO metrics that are used on IT side. And finally, I would say it's also about enabling the, accompanying infrastructure. By infrastructure, I don't mean the physical side of the infrastructure, but having, the necessary paperwork in place. Are your contracts sort of covered for that kind of, recovery? Do you have a process, the right kind of authorizations for your suppliers, the right kind of qualifications, certifications? Have you got them in place? So that's what I mean by infrastructure. Have the right contract design. So once you've looked at all this, you will actually, and especially, the point about right sizing your service level desire in case of a disruption, you will come up with a model of resiliency for your company. So, George, that's my take on how one should define resiliency.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Vivek. And definitely the points you made. Yes, it's a journey. There's a lot of things to think about, but it quantifies. It takes away from it just being a buzzword where someone says, "Are you resilient?" Yeah, I think so. These are the things that you have to evaluate internally to help you understand. Okay, I know so. So, we've talked about what we mean by resiliency, and let's talk about kind of when we do an internal evaluation, what are those points that immediately that I should start looking at within my company to understand, how my supply chain will perform from a resiliency perspective?
Yes, George. One of the most important things I would say when you look at the supply chain, uh, so there's a concept that I like to talk about, and I call it the customer order decoupling point. That means at what point in your supply chain, up to what point in your supply chain are you decoupled from your customer order? That regardless of what your customer wants, you can go on doing, before that point, you can go on doing what you want to do. So consider a food distribution business. So they don't bother so much about the immediate customer demand. They build to a forecast. So they keep ordering regardless of immediate customer orders. So identify that decoupling point in your supply chain, because that's most important, because you need to treat one part differently and the other part differently, right? So a company which manufactures only to order versus company which manufactures to stock will have to, react differently or build their resiliency differently. So understand that part. That's one. The second thing that I really, want everyone to, would recommend that everyone evaluate is what is the nature of transparency that they have in supply chain. So here, perception versus reality. I'll just narrate a figure to you from the, European world. There's a survey which happens every 6 months, and the perception about transparency of their supply chains with CPOs and CSCOs was that 95% felt their supply chain, they have full transparency into their supply chain. But after the disruption, caused by this pandemic, that figure, in the same survey, that figure went down to 27%. Because, getting something, information on demand from your account manager is different from having real supply chain transparency. So please differentiate, understand that whether you have real, non-person dependent transparency into your lower tiers of the supply chain. So that's the second element you must understand. Then, as I said, linked to the first one, once you understand your decoupling point, customer order decoupling point, you would know which customer contracts will actually influence or impact your supply side contract. You'll be able to establish that linkage. So you know that when, let's say, on customer side, something is disrupted, the cascading impact on supply side, or vice versa, once you've established that linkage. So that's the third thing that, I would recommend that people looking to sort of put in a model should understand about their supply chain. The fourth really is looking at your qualification benchmarks. So what happens is supplier qualification benchmarks, that is. So what really happens is you have suppliers of different abilities in your ecosystem all the time, right? But it's important to know that, given a different service level, given a different circumstance, you could use a differently ranked or differently qualified suppliers. So if you've got that understanding in place,
Hmm.
that your qualifications are set up, that data is transparent to you, then it's very important. Very easy to find alternate sources and repurpose your contracts and come back on your feet. So the screening is the onboarding related supplier screening is one of the loads that people undergo in a disruption like this. So that can be eased as well. So that's another aspect that one must look at. What is the kind of information database that they maintain about their suppliers and their capabilities and qualifications? So these I would say are broadly 4 or 5 things one must look at.
Yeah, it's very interesting, Vivek, especially, the first point about the supply and demand coupling points where, if I understand correctly, you should have a modular view of your supply chain to really understand, okay, it is not 100% of your supply chain is not the view. I mean, that is a good view to have, but really you're looking at points A to B and B to C and understand and evaluate them to see, okay, is there transparency in those modules, which add up to transparency across the supply chain, which will also, in fact, help you understand, okay, what will the cascading impact be if there is a change from one module to the other? And also to your last point about, allows you to benchmark and qualify the suppliers within those specific modules versus saying, this is how it functions all the way across. So yeah, great points. Thank you. Within an organization, what are some specific actions, or, project or something an organization can undertake to accelerate their journey to getting to that, you know, ideal world would be 100% supply chain, but we have to start somewhere. Like, what does that look like?
Okay. So, we just discussed, right, the internal stuff that one must look at. Now, so that's more from the kind of design, process design, etc. that you will have. I think the other aspect really is what are those disruption triggers, right? One has to understand the disruption triggers, that what all could cause disruptions in my supply chain, because then you can become specific about the action. So how do you start understanding the disruption triggers and sources of disruption in your supply chain? I think the first thing always generally goes to understanding the spread of your customer and supplier base, both of them. And this has to be understood in terms of the geographical spread. That's one thing. Uh, the You must segment it financially as well, by capability as defined in your industries, etc. I'll tell you what I mean by that. So geographical spread is a no-brainer. So you know that there's an earthquake or some disruption in a geography, uh, you're going to face a situation. But let's say there's a financial crisis in the financial world where uh, suppliers or customers or companies which had borrowed, which have a certain kind of, debt structuring are going to be impacted, right? Suppose that's a segmentation. That's what I mean by financial spread and other kind of segmentation. So please understand, try and understand your supply base and customer base in terms of these different segmentations. These segmentations will be different for different companies, but be aware that there are segmentations other than geographical. Typical way of looking at it is geographical, but there are many more ways of looking at it, right? So that's the second action that you need to take. So start sort of slicing, dicing, looking at your supply base, customer base in that sense. The third is what I like to call build a risk-aware process framework. That means your typical supply chain processes, whether it's to do with the supplier lifecycle management, source to contract, or procure to pay, or any of these processes, uh, build a process which somehow, based on the data, the kind of transactions that are happening, would be able to identify and trigger some alerts that there's a change in pattern. Somebody, either it can be smart enough to give you a conclusion that something wrong's happened, or at the very minimum alert somebody that there's a pattern we're noticing, somebody needs to look at it. So that's the, I would say, the third thing that one must do. So identify, what are those processes which are not really risk aware, where nobody is looking at these aspects or not trying to sense that there could be a risk of disruption. The fourth aspect I would say one must do is, many companies have a practice of periodic review of, looking at risk and disruption and all that. From there, you've got to switch to a model which is more like sensors embedded in your ecosystem, which means continuous monitoring, right? So, this could come in terms of subscription to, let's say, industry watch list or certain credit rating services or whatever. So the moment one of your customers or suppliers is facing a problem or starts finding a negative mention, let's say on social media, I mean, there are possibilities of integrating all that. There is somebody, either, some red flag goes up or somebody is alerted to look at that. And so that's continuous monitoring. So instead of leaving the discovery to the next quarterly review or the next half yearly review, you will be alerted to finding this out. So try and set up, these kind of sensors, as I like to say. And I think one of the most important I would mention in the end is about contract playbooks. Okay. So the fact is that all our supply chain sort of commitments on both sides, customer side as well as supplier side, are enshrined in our contracts, right? So I think introduce a notion of having contract playbooks wherein those playbooks start guiding you to have a operational recourse to things rather than just a legal recourse. The typical contract design is to have a legal recourse to something when something undesirable happens. From there, start designing it to have operational recourse, and that's resiliency then. Rather than saying, okay, now I'll go to an arbitrator. It should be, this is what you will do. So that's in our contract playbook domain. So I think these are the 4 or 5 things they can start your resiliency journey pretty well and efficiently.
Yeah, thanks, Vivek. And, it's a good point in there that you raised about how often the resiliency becomes these periodic one-time exercises that happen maybe once a quarter or once every 6 months. And it's challenging when it's a scramble, right? Suddenly you have to go and reach out to all your suppliers and start generating reports, and you smash something together to present it. And it's inefficient. There can be a lot of inaccuracies just because of the fire drill nature of it. Whereas, if you establish these, when you really understand it and you establish what are those modules, what are possible types of disruptions can happen, what are the triggers and what are the signals, importantly, establish those so you understand, like, if something happens sometime mid-cycle, you'll know that it's happening. And then the operational recourse is, okay, have the awareness to understand, okay, how you would actually react in the case of this. So we have a case study where, a technology and process rigor was utilized to ensure that not just your tier 1 customers are on the same page, but that for important provisions, the entirety of the supply ecosystem were also subject to these clauses and obligations, to ultimately create transparency across an entire supply chain for an automotive manufacturer. So let's get into that next.
Yeah, I think you bring this case study at an appropriate time, and the visual depiction here. Let me just explain this in a sense. So there are certain contract terms which as we were discussing, unless they are followed through all the tiers of the supply chain, will ultimately result in operational inefficiency. Even if you have a legal recourse to somebody's default, it does cause an operational disruption. So from there, as I mentioned, you want to get to a situation where you detect it early and are able to act in time before it proves disastrous. So that's resiliency. So in this case, there's this automotive manufacturer, very well known, one of the luxury brands in the world, got a multi-tier supply chain. And from a sustainability perspective, there are lots of, good manufacturing practices that are mandated to be followed by every tier in the supply chain. Okay. Ethical practices, good manufacturing practices. So we actually, deployed a solution, technology-enabled solution. So if I am able to just to sort of share the complexity of this company's supply chain, let me show you, a dashboard kind of view uh, on this. So these, they actually, now this is the network. It looks, it's all over the place, right? Everyone's supplying to everyone, and ultimately it's landing up, with the original manufacturer. But anything goes wrong in this network, right? It's the ultimately the car manufacturer who's going to suffer, whether it's from a le- legal regulatory compliance perspective, or even if it's from an operational perspective. So here's what the solution does. Now look at these different colored. Each box is representing a company in the supply chain, and the lines are actually connectors are showing you who's supplying to whom, right? So the green one says we've taken an example of one compliance clause which everyone is obligated to follow in the supply chain. And what the technology enables is it allows sort of sharing the specific contract terms that need to be complied to by everyone across this chain. So the red box there shows that when the first default happens, this network, which is actually a blockchain that we have commissioned, it's a permission blockchain, but that's not the point. The blockchain is not the point. So that red box is sensed, and that signal travels all the way up back to the original equipment manufacturer. And before it turns disastrous, everyone in the chain can gear themselves up to sort of either prevent that or be ready to respond to that, or in this example, it's a case of non-compliance alert that red colored company that you please mend your ways or whatever it is. So that's the example of what transparency truly means, the kind of resilience. So now look at the resilience here. I mean, before it results in a disaster, people have taken measures, adapted, held review meetings, and all that is happening. Good. I hope.
Yeah. So thanks, Vivek. When I first saw this graphic, I was taken aback, and I was thinking, what am I looking at? This is so complex. But the reality is, I mean, if you were to map out, most larger companies and even mid-sized companies, you map out your supply chain, and it potentially is this complex. And the modularity we talked about is critical here to really understand what are those unique pieces that will be affected, in what way will they be affected, how will we know they're affected, as is signified by the red box here. And then if you have those operational recourses along your supply chain, you can be agile and you can react to it. And in this case, the technology that was used was blockchain to set up the system of triggers, but like you mentioned, that's not important. Like that was a technology which is used, but what's important is what was done with it. And there are many other ways to do it using technology, not necessarily have it be blockchain. So speaking of kind of ways to establish this, now if I'm at a company, what are some things that I could do today? So like this week, if I come away from this, what are things that I should do? Maybe some immediate questions I could ask myself.
As I mentioned, the ultimate source of your commercial commitments, entitlements, obligations is enshrined in your contracts, right? So think of your supply chain as a chain of contracts. Each contract sort of feeding into the other or whatever, and ultimately delivering value to the customer. So having that, the process view overlaid with your contract sort of landscape. Why I insist on contracts is because that's the ultimate commitment. That's what your company is committed to in writing, and that's what, if you're delivering, you're compliant in every possible way. So that I would say is essentially the first thing. Look at your process design, look at your contract structures. Why structure? Because, as I mentioned, I alluded to it that is there a contract playbook in place, right? which allows you or guides you to design it for operational recourse rather than just legal recourse.
Right.
Are your risks identified as per that playbook, proactively? So that all that goes into process design and looking at the way your contracts are linked. So that's, I would say, very, very important to have. Uh, the next thing that probably, one can look at, uh, it was also covered in this example, the case example that we just discussed, right? Knowing the partners, and knowing is not just about sort of, collecting some information and keeping it in your database and retrieving it. So if you see, there's a notion of Industry 4.0, which a lot of manufacturers actually follow, right? They talk of digital twins and whatnot. So this is actually, knowing your partner is about almost creating a digital twin of your supply chain partner, which means the kind of information and systems that you've got in place to manage that partner information. You can almost get answers out of that system which an account manager would otherwise provide. So that's the notion of suppliers digital twin, which is of course a more advanced state, but the point that really emphasizes is you're so tightly integrated, you're working so closely with your partners that all aspects of business, your needs, etc., are known to each other. So that's where, a system like SRM or supplier relationship management actually comes in. And don't just think of it as a system that you're going to implement to collect a lot of information. Think about the objective, as you, does that SRM system talk to your contracting system, your sourcing system, your P2P system, all of that. The holistic process design has to be taken care of. The SRM can be the sort of one of the important pieces of that puzzle, but it's not to say that you put in an SRM system and you're done with it, but a very important sort of cog in that wheel. So that's the second important point. The third, I would say, if your the call to action really is about, as we said, the ultimate truth is the contract. So what are your obligations? What are your risks? So this is where technology can come to aid, because your typical contract is very obscure legal language, difficult to sort of understand unless you're a trained contract reader, so to say. So use technology there to, I would say, at least get a long list of your obligations and go through it very quickly. So the initial scanning of contracts and candidate obligations and your entitlements can be quickly identified. So anytime that you miss those, then you is a risk. So, and how easily, whether you are able to fulfill that obligation or not, your ability to fulfill that also exposes you to risk. So, generate that awareness about what your obligations to your customers, to your partners, suppliers are, whether you have a capability and the resources to deliver that in the time that it's actually been committed. If not, it's a risk. Or even tracking it, even the ones that are within your capability, tracking those to see that they're actually, delivered with discipline on time. And anytime that they're not fulfilled, it triggers a risk action, within your organization. So that's where technology can actually come to use to very quickly give you control of thousands of contracts that you may have in your company. George?
Yeah, good point, Vivek. I think the key thing again, it comes back to understanding the section. So, you could go through an exercise where you say, let me take one part of my supply chain and split it up into modules that make sense within my company. Look at those contracts within those modules and understand what are the obligations and risks within those contracts, and then run some water through the pipes, see what happens, like simulate an issue, see what happens at that point and what happens across your supply chain. Now, if you have a contract management system that makes it significantly easier to do, but you should be able to do it this week. You should be able to go and get your contracts together without even a contract management system. It would take longer, but you can do it. And something that's highly recommended is to, to build that muscle, do those practice exercises, simulate outcomes, and based on that, start to shape your playbook and your operational recourses. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our session. Vivek, thank you so much for your time. This was incredibly valuable. Every time I speak with you, I feel like I learn more about this space. So I personally do appreciate it. Thank you all for attending.
Yeah, thank you, George. Really enjoyed the conversation. I hope the audience finds it useful as well.
So thank you all for joining us in this session. Now we'll be opening up for Q&A. So please drop us your questions in the chat.